So we have a video recording by Dr. Rakesh Mohan as a special address, right after which we'll proceed into the panel discussion in infrastructure. Thank you.
Mr. Pradeep Singh, Mr. Rangnikar, Mr. Harishankaran, Mr. Ashok Lavasa, Mr. Krishnan, and Professor Richard Neuvel. It's a real honor for me to be giving this keynote address at the National Conclave of Indian School of Business at this session on institutional mechanisms and incentive structures, drivers for robust infrastructure. I'm taking this opportunity to give a very brief overview of the India Transport Report, Moving India to 2032, which was indeed the final report of the National Transport Development Policy Committee, which was submitted to the government in March 2014, earlier this year. What I would like to do today is to give this broad overview of the transport sector, where it is, the key issues, and also where we need to go in terms of policy in the transport sector. Let me start by providing the objective of this report. What we were asked to do really is to look at a coherent transport strategy for India in the long term. And we interpreted the long term to be 2 decades from the beginning of the country's 12th five-year plan up to the end of what would be the 15th five-year plan if we actually continue with five-year plan mechanism. Our vision is that a well-developed and competent institutional system for planning, management, and execution of transport policies should be in place by the end of this period, but of course preferably much earlier. What we need to understand is that investment in transport is absolutely essential for the economy as a whole to be able to grow. As there is increasing prosperity in the country, as our GDP growth continues, as it has for the last 30 years, the next 20, 30 years, there will be increasing demand for transport infrastructure. One of the key issues that has arisen in recent years is the Indian manufacturing sector basically not growing in the last couple of years, and our view is that both from the point of view of the demand for transport coming from the manufacturing sector, but also demand for manufacturing coming from investments from the transport sector. So we have both demand and supply that is important in looking at the investment transport sector. And finally, looking also at agriculture, that one of the issues that has arisen in the last few years is very high inflation in the last 4 or 5 years or so, and one of the reasons for that people have adduced are indeed the supply bottlenecks that pervade the agriculture sector. And very clearly we need to do a great deal of work to alleviate supply bottlenecks and increase connectivity across the country, and that will also help in reducing inflation. So investment in transport, in brief, is a response both to emerging demand, but is also an emerging economic growth driver in itself. What we've tried to do in the report is a clear prioritization of where such investments should be focused in the transport sector. The country still hasn't really paid much attention to the proper development of a multimodal transport system in the country. And what is important is that we need a multimodal transport system both for within country needs, but also to promote trade with the rest of the world. So we have focused on the new thrust for more effective investment in transport as a whole. What we found is that in almost every transport sector that we know that we have examined in the country, that we need to invest a great deal in building capacity in human resources in the sector. And also we need to accelerate reform measures in the current regulatory regime. There's some broad, almost what you might call obvious characteristics that need to guide the investments to be made. Clearly they need to be cost effective. We also need to pay much greater attention to safety in the country, safety in transport. Increasingly we have to give much more attention to an environmentally sustainable system of transport, And we need to make the Indian transport system to be much more responsive to the needs of its customers and the needs of the economy. It's a very quick review of what we've actually done, say, since mid-1990s. We have indeed made a great deal of progress in some sectors and perhaps not as much in others. What has improved? First, in the case of roads, with the initiation of the of the National Highway Development Project, the Golden Quadrilateral, east, west, and north, south highways on the one hand, that is basically the rollout of the National Highway Development Project, and second, through the initiation of the Prime Minister's Gram Sadak Yojana on rural roads, that a great deal of improvement has indeed taken place in the last 15 years or so in the road sector. In fact, according to the calculations that we could make, according to the estimates we could find, the total investment in roads has gone up from around 0.4% of GDP in the late 1990s to around 1.1% of GDP on an annual basis now. Another big success has been huge expansion of the civil aviation capacity, increased competition. So there's been really a large-scale transformation in civil aviation and convenience of passengers in getting frequent flights to the major destinations within the country. What has not changed very much? One is a very inefficient port structure. We have continued with the obsolete structure of port trusts, where you have the landlord, that is the port trust, and the operator all being the same, that is the port trust itself, while we have, of course, included some new private investment in new terminals. Urban transport, which all of us are afflicted with every day, is inefficient, it's inadequate, it's unreliable, and unsafe. And finally, but to my mind most importantly, the investment in railways has been highly inadequate, whereas till, as I said, the late 1990s, the investment in roads was around 0.4% of GDP. It was around the same level of investment in the railways at that time, around 0.4% of GDP on an annual basis. Now, according to our estimates, we need to substantially increase investment in the railways to a similar level of 1 to 1.1% of GDP in the coming years. A key issue has been a lack of reform in the railways for the separation of roles of the railway board. Policy issues, policy should be separated from the regulatory activities, and of course the management of the network. As of course many of you would be aware, I had the privilege of chairing the Indian Railways Reforms Committee in expert group on railways in the late 1990s, early 2000s, when I submitted the India Railways report in 2001, which had indeed placed a great deal of emphasis on very substantive railways reform. I'm afraid this has not happened so far. Let me just say what is different in this report from many others in transport. First, most of the thinking on transport policy in India and planning of transport in India has been far too project-centric, so that we roll out projects and that's all we do through the planning system, and of course all the ministries that are separate. What we have tried to do is to adopt a systems-based approach across modes of transport, administrative geographies, and we've tried to also integrate our thinking on regulatory development, capacity development, and human resource development. We have focused less on specific immediate solutions. We have focused much more on developing the human resources capacity and responsible institutions that indeed can adapt to the changing realities as we go along. And the point here is that taking a 20-year perspective, we can be sure that any projections that we make now, which we have indeed done, will be wrong in the years to come. That is to say that we can be sure that energy prices will change over time, new technologies will come in, and so on. So that it is absolutely essential that the policy capacity in the country needs to be such that we can adapt on a continuous basis as time goes along and as conditions change. And therefore, we believe it's most important to invest in human resource capacity and to build the appropriate institutions that can indeed adapt to changing realities as we go across. Second, in the past, there's been almost no thinking on how to connect India with its own vicinity, that is South Asia, and of course towards East Asia as a whole, Southeast Asia as a whole. As it happens, the South Asia sub-region is perhaps the least interconnected in the world in terms of trade and in terms of transport connectivity. So the NTDPC adopted a specific focus on developing a dense web of transport links with neighboring countries. We've also given very special attention to the transport needs of the Northeast, which is also very, very interconnected with the progress we make on developing interconnections with Bangladesh on the one hand and Myanmar and other Southeast Asian countries to the east. I'm delighted to see that the Prime Minister has been emphasizing the connectivity with the East through the Look East policy, and that new specific actions are indeed being taken to bring to fruition the kind of connectivity we need to the rest of the region. Now, what is the growth perspective that we've adopted? First, we actually developed a relatively complex macro model. It is a consistency model, and we try to project all the major macro variables over the next 20 years. This was a very difficult exercise to do, particularly during this period, because at the time when we started in 2010, there was a very high expectation that we would continue with 7-8% growth onwards. Of course, we are very aware that growth has indeed come down to near 5% in the last 2 or 3 years, and that it will be a major effort to first get it up to at least 7% in the next few years, and then follow it up by a consistent 8 to 9% over the next 15 years or so to 2032. Assuming that this does take place, what will be required? First, that investment does need to increase from about 35% of GDP to around 40% of GDP over this period. Now, this is not a wild idea, given that in 2007-8, we had indeed already approached a gross domestic capital formation level of 38-39% of GDP. So what we are suggesting is not something that is not consistent with the kind of investment levels that we have achieved in the past. What this needs, however, this is very important to understand, is that we need to restore industrial growth to around 10% per year for the duration of the next 15 years or so. This is not something that we have done. We have not been able to achieve 10% growth in the manufacturing sector for any 5-year period in our history. So here is a big ask, and again, I'm delighted to see that the Prime Minister is indeed emphasizing the Make in India campaign. And what this requires, to be consistent with this kind of a growth scenario, our estimates suggest that the increase in transport investment needs to go up from around 2.6% of GDP on a consistent basis in the 11th 5-year plan to 3.3% in the current plan, 12th 5-year plan, and then stabilize to around 3.7% of GDP till 2032. In absolute terms, what this means is that over each of these following plan periods, that we need to have almost a 7-fold increase in real terms in total transport investment, going from the 11th plan to the 15th plan if it does indeed fructify. We made pretty detailed estimates of the financial resources available for overall investment in the country, for total infrastructure investment in the country, and of course then for transport investment. We did project that total infrastructure investment ought to go up from around 5.5% in the 11th plan to around 8% in the future. We have emphasized that both public sector investment and private sector investment will be very important. It will be important to keep up the public sector rate of investment and perhaps increase it slightly, while of course making all the conditions easier for private sector investment in all areas of transport. Within public sector investments, our estimates suggest that within the public sector investment was 70% of resources should come from the budget and about 30% from the internal extra budgetary resources of public sector enterprises. For the private sector investment, we estimated that about 2/3 should be come from domestic investment and about 1/3 from foreign investment. We did very detailed exercises to try and estimate the kind of increase in demand that will take place in transport over the next 15 to 20 years, consistent with the kind of GDP growth that we have been talking about. That is going up to 7% in the 12th plan and going out to 8 to 9% in future 5-year periods up to 2032. So consistent with these kind of growth numbers and looking at the elasticities of demand for transport in the past, it is very important to understand that we are really looking at a kind of increase in transport demand over the next 20 years that we have not seen in the past. Our expectation is that demand for freight transport will go up by a factor of 7, from something like 2,000 billion ton kilometers to something between 10,000 and 13,000 BTKM. Domestic air traffic we expect to increase from about 60 million passengers a year to around 400 million passengers a year. An international air passenger traffic we expect to go up from about 40 million to around 200 million over the same period. These are very, very large increases in demand, and to bring Indian transport capacity to be able to cope with such increase in demand, and of course if we don't do it, we won't get the kind of growth that we are projecting, that we will need to design an integrated transport network and governance structures and organizational cultures in each of the areas: railways, ports, civil aviation, roads, urban transport, to have seamless intermodal and hierarchical connectivity. I hope you can see the wording on the slide. I'm afraid it's a little small, but I hope that you can still look at it. The key point for the railways that we need to first observe is that from about a 90% share in freight in the railways at around the time of independence, the late 1940s to around now, the share has come down from 90% to 30%. And the share of railways in passenger transport has over the same period come down from around 70% to just 10%. Now, it is certainly true that in every country, as motorized transport has become easier, as investments have been made in 4-lane highways and expressways, etc., that railways have lost share in every major economy in the world. So this is not unusual. What is unusual is that our decline is much steeper than in other large economies. From our point of view, given that we don't so far have major availability of domestic resources in terms of petroleum, and also the damaging environmental impact of fossil fuels, that from our point of view, it is really even more important that we bring back both freight and passenger traffic to the railways as far as possible. And so this will involve making strategic decisions regarding the relative allocation of investment in railways rather than roads, and accompanying pricing and taxation policies that can indeed nudge transport demand from road to the railways. And therefore, a key, to my mind, the most important issue facing the country in terms of strategy in transport is the capacity expansion of the railways over the next few years and going on a continuous basis for the next 20 years, something that we have not seen since independence. And just as the vision of the National Highway Development Project completely changed the face of the country through 4-lane highways, along with the provision of the PMGSY in terms of rural roads, we need to have a similar bold vision for the railways for the future. As I've said before, the annual investment in railways needs to increase from the current 0.4-0.5% of GDP to around 1% of GDP, as it has been done in roads over the last 15 years. With the appointment of my friend Mr. Suresh Prabhu as Railways Minister, I'm now much more hopeful that this indeed will get done. Coming to ports, as I said before, the governance structure of ports in India is very antiquated. First, we need to be, in terms of consistent with the kind of growth of the economy that we are thinking about, we need that we expect that the share of India's share in world trade should roughly double in the next 20 years or so. There is at present no comprehensive strategy for the location of ports in the country or an overall investment program in ports. We have indeed made a good deal of progress in getting much more private investment in ports, but we still do not really have a comprehensive view on how the kind of capacity expansion needed in ports will actually happen. We looked very carefully at the rest of the world in terms of the port provision, and we found that in most of the major economies, each of the countries has a few well-connected major megaports and very well connected with inland transportation system. And as it happens, India does not have any major megaport by global standards. And as a consequence, a good deal of India's maritime trade is indeed transshipped through Colombo or Singapore. So what we have suggested is that we do need to establish 2 or maybe even 3, but certainly 2 megaports on each of the east and west coasts over the next 20 years. And to do this, a major suggestion that we have made in terms of their governance is that we need to turn the governance system into landlord ports. So there have to be, for the major ports, for the mega ports, what you will need is a public authority that is the landlord, and all the existing port trusts should be corporatized, so that once you have a landlord port which is indeed a public authority, then the public sector terminal, which will be the corporatized part of the port trust, and private sector terminals that are coming in will then be on an even keel as far as competition is concerned. And our view is that this will help a great deal in the kind of expansion of ports that we envisage. On the case of civil aviation, given the kind of expansion of passenger demand that we had given for both domestic passengers as well as international passengers, we do need a national master plan for airport development over a 20-30 year time frame. And we need to set up an airport approvals commission within the Ministry of Civil Aviation to review and clear these plans on an ongoing basis, so that there's quick decision making and that investment in ports is done on a continuous basis. And we also need to develop much greater facilities for off-airport processing facilities similar to inland ports and container depots that we already have. How will all this be done? As I said, one of our major findings was that the country just does not have adequate capacity in terms of planning capacity, research capacity, etc., for adequate development transport capacity in the country. So what we have suggested is we examined the governance systems and institutional systems and human resource capacities in other major countries, and what we find is that almost all other major countries have much more significant airport planning capacity. So what we have suggested in the short to medium term is that we really need to set up an integrated office for transport strategy in the short to medium term, which should be an independent agency, a technical agency associated with the planning commission or its successor. The important point is that we need an agency that has adequate technical capacity to do the kind of work that the NTDPC did, but on a continuous basis. It must have the resources to bring a strong technical team. It must be able to manage and analyze transport data. It should initiate activities so that enough data are generated, and of course it should be relatively independent, and it should be high level enough to to be able to take an integrated view on a technical basis for the kind of capacity investments and technology investments that need to be done on an ongoing basis. Second, what we found is that India now stands out among all the major countries for not having a unified Ministry of Transport. No other significant or major country in the world has the kind of the kind of number of transport ministries that we have in our country. So what we have suggested is that, just like other countries, in order to develop an integrated, unified transport system in the country, it is very important to really now unify the Ministry of, to have a unified Ministry of Transport, which includes all other transport, existing transport ministries. The existing ministries, including the railways, should then become departments focused on delivering effective transport infrastructure and services for each mode. For the railways, of course, we have recommended corporatization of railways, which we'll come to in a second. The new ministry should could be carefully structured so that it can maintain an incentive structure that encourages technical excellence, open-minded consideration of all available options, and consistent attention on transport system rather than particular means. So we've also then suggested that just like the central level, we have an office for transport strategy in the short to medium term. The states should also then have state level offices of transport strategy at the state level, and also unified Ministry of Transport in the medium to long term. And as far as regulation is concerned, we have supported the current approach of continuing with separate regulators for each sector. Some other cross-cutting issues we found to be very important. First, on fiscal issues, we were quite staggered. We did major research into the existing state level taxes that affect the transport sector, and quite frankly, we were staggered to find the kind of complex fiscal structure, the complex tax structure that exists at the state level which affects the transport sector. So what we have suggested is that, just as we have been very successful in simplifying a similarly complicated state level sales tax structure to a relatively unified state VAT, and hopefully we'll be moving towards a GST in the near future, that we could use a similar mechanism that is set up state finance ministers empowered committee to look at all the transport taxes that affect all the taxes that affect transport, and then arrive at some kind of unified structure which would be common across the states. This is very important to again achieve the goal of an efficient common market in the country, and it'll make on the one hand it'll make the economy much more efficient. On the other hand, it'll certainly make transport much more efficient. Second, we have provided the data in our report on the number of deaths and injuries that are taking place on a daily basis on Indian roads, railways, in cities. Again, we examined the international experience on safety. We have recommended that we establish independent national safety boards for each of the sectors: roads, railways, water, and these should be again professional bodies to be staffed by professionals at the highest levels. And these bodies should be separate or independent of respective operational agencies. And each of the operating departments should also have safety, or each of the operating agencies should also have safety departments to ensure day-to-day compliance with the safety standards that come out of the national safety boards. In examining the international experience on this, it's very clear that it is possible, with focused attention on safety, to bring down injuries and deaths from transport accidents very, very dramatically. And that is something that is very urgent for us to do. There is really very little research capacity in the country for transport. So what we are suggesting is to earmark 1% of investment in the transport sector for R&D, institution building and capacity building in both the public and private sectors. We have suggested that we should initiate a process to set up a variety of research institutions, Indian Institute of Transport Research, Indian Institute for Transportation Statistics, Rose Standards Institutes, and so on. The point to emphasize is that the country of our size, the country of the size of the size of the transport sector, it is really a shame that we don't have the kind of technical capacity that's needed for the adequate development of the transport sector in the future. At the same time, we need to set up centers of excellence in selected universities and research institutes in each transport sector. And finally, given that existing personnel will be there for the next 20 years, that we should aim to upgrade existing personnel by ensuring training on a continuous basis for 2 to 5% of all the personnel on an annual basis, so that they also come up to the new technical standards that are required in the transportation sector. I had mentioned earlier that we do need to be very conscious of energy and environment. One, of course, major issue that I've alluded to a number of times is to arrest and reverse the increasing mode share of road transport for both passengers and freight towards railways. But here we can also do much more to prioritize inland waterways and coastal shipping for the movement of bulk cargo. Inland waterways, particularly in the northeast, and coastal shipping around both the coasts. And of course, encourage the use of public transport and non-motorized transport in all our cities. Second, most of our cities have become somewhat unlivable in terms of the air pollution. According to international observations, Indian cities are among the most polluted, including comparison with cities like Beijing, which have also become notorious for the kind of air pollution they're suffering because of the transport sector, because of the huge number of cars that have been added. So we have suggested that we need to accelerate these vehicle standards in terms of pollution, and that this should be done on a regular basis and not sporadically. So we have suggested that we need to create the National Automobile Pollution and Fuel Authority that should be set up for setting and enforcing vehicle standards and fuel quality standards in India. And an Auto Fuel Policy Committee ought to be established every 5 years to ensure air quality for our citizens. We've also looked at some detail in the use of ICT, that is information and communication technology, to make our transport systems much more efficient. A great deal can be done in almost every area of transport. In freight transport, in terms of tracking and optimizing the transport of freight, trade facilitation through the lowering of transaction costs in ports through the use of ICT. Aviation, a great deal has already been done, but much more can be done by greater use of IT. In case of roads, smart cards and electronic tolls can be made much more standardized across the country, so that tolls can be collected without any vehicles actually stopping. These are all technologies that are available today, and a great deal can be done in urban transport through cross-border smart cards, concession pricing, and so on. And the important point here is that most of these technologies are available off the shelf today. Given the pace of innovation taking place in ICT across the world, we can expect much more to come from this area in the future. So, but all this also needs standardization, and for this we have recommended the establishment of Indian Institute for Information Technology and Transformation, We need to remember that this is sort of similar in idea to the banking, the Institute for IDBRT, the Institute of Development of Banking Technologies, set up by the Reserve Bank quite some time back, which has really made a difference in terms of making e-transactions much easier across banks. And we need some kind of institution of the kind we're suggesting to be able to do the kind of improvements that we have proposed. One very important area that we looked at was the connection between energy and transportation. The demand for energy, what we found is that, very broadly speaking, the elasticity demand for energy is around unity, the income elasticity demand for energy. So assuming that GDP grows by a factor of 4 in the next 20 years, the demand for energy will also likely to increase by a factor of 4 in the next 20 years. And as you know, it's 7% annual growth means doubling every 10 years, so quadrupling in 4 years, in 20 years. Over this period, even though a great deal of effort needs to be made to diversify energy sources from coal towards other sources, nonetheless, given the energy composition of the country, that we will continue to be somewhat dependent on coal. And what we find is that production of coal could perhaps be expected to increase by about 2.5 times in the next 20 years, with increasing import of coal from the rest of the world. The intensity of steel use could go by a factor of 8. So with this huge increases in the demand for coal, both domestic and imported, the demand for steel, again both domestic and imported, that the transportation requirement of these bulk commodities pose a great challenge, because already railway system is basically clogged for these in the transportation of these commodities. So what we recommended is that the urgent action is required looking ahead for the transportation of these bulk commodities. We need to focus immediately railways investments on the feeder routes on the coal and iron ore mines located mostly in the tri-state area of Chhattisgarh, Odisha and Jharkhand. Among the dedicated freight corridors, we need to place the greatest emphasis on completion of the eastern freight corridor on time, and also to focus attention on promoting coastal shipping for the coal producing areas to the eastern coast to provide to avoid over the land long overland transportation of coal. And of course, as I mentioned before, selection of sites for 4 to 6 megaports over the next 20 years. So this is absolutely, that if this is not done, that is, if focus is not done on investment in the railways and capacity expansion in the railways for bulk transport of commodities, for the bulk commodities, then we will have difficulty achieving the kind of growth rates that we are envisaging. So let me conclude, let me summarize. It's a long report, it's in 5 volumes. In a 30 to 40 minutes, I can only give a very short summary. We have emphasized the need for modernization, expansion of all segments of the transport system, and the building of capacity to do it. We've emphasized the building of institutions at national, state, and local levels, particularly embedded with technocratic technical capacity, both quality and quantity. We have advocated the setting up or operation of existing regulatory authorities on a more efficient basis. We have placed particular emphasis on setting up or strengthening of R&D institutions in transport. We have also emphasized the rationalization of fiscal regimes affecting transport, and also, I would say most important, embedding safety concerns in transport planning and its execution. Let me do a commercial. The India Transport Report Moving India 2032 has been published by Rutledge India on behalf of the Planning Commission, and this can be ordered through Flipkart and other usual means of getting the report, and it is also available on the Planning Commission website, where you see the National Transport Development Policy Committee on the website. Let me conclude by especially thanking Mr. Pradeep Singh for making this possible. I had wanted to be in India at this time to actually give this keynote address in person. Unfortunately, I couldn't manage the dates adequately, and then Mr. Pradeep Singh had this great idea of being able to do it through this telecast. I do hope that you found this of interest and that this will induce you to actually look at the detailed work that we did in the National Transport Development Policy Committee. Thank you very much.
While he can't hear our claps, I think certainly we can do better than that for all the efforts that he's put in. Thank you. This is to thank Dr. Rakesh Mohan in absentia. And with that, it's my pleasure now to invite Pradeep Singh onto the dais. Pradeep is the CEO of the Mohali campus and Deputy Dean at the Indian School of Business. And a very quick short introduction of Pradeep, and I'll try and attempt doing that. In his previous roles, Pradeep Singh has served as the Vice Chairman and CEO of IDFC Projects Limited and was the founding CEO of ILFS Infrastructure Development Corporation. He oversaw the development of infrastructure projects in public-private partnership formats in collaboration with state and central governments in various sectors, including roads, ports, airports, water supply and sewage systems, e-governance, industrial parks, and tourism. He has worked in the commercialized infrastructure sector in the field for over 16 years. Earlier, from 1978 to 1995, Pradeep was a member of the Indian Administrative Service and later also served as the Assistant Country Director at Care India, an international NGO. Pradeep, over to you for the next session.
Thank you, Guru. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. So to this, as the grand finale of today's formal events, we have the session on infrastructure before, of course, we open up the bar downstairs. The theme of the infrastructure session, as you know, is about institutional mechanisms and incentive structures, drivers for robust infrastructure growth. And for this session, we've assembled, I must say, a rather formidable panel for you. We have with us Mr. Hari Shankaran, the Vice Chairman and Managing Director of ILFS. May I invite the panelists to please come on the stage. We have with us Mr. Ashok Lavasa, the Secretary to Government of India in the Ministry of Environment and Forests, Mr. K.P. Krishnan, the Additional Secretary for the Ministry of Land Resources and Rural Development, and Mr. Dr. Richard Dinefil, the professor at the MIT, and as you perhaps know, MIT is a partner of the Punj Lloyd Institute for Infrastructure Development at the ISB. Did I do okay in pronouncing your last name, Richard?
Perfect.
Yeah? Okay. Good. So, and I can assure you that with the panel that's sitting around me, you will have an enjoyable, stimulating, perhaps even entertaining evening ahead of you. Between these four gentlemen, in many ways, perhaps lie all the answers, maybe even the responses that we need to break the logjam on infrastructure development that we seem to be faced in the country today. Mr. Hari Shankaran, who's going to be delivering the keynote address in a couple of minutes, has been arguably among the handful of pioneers, if I may say so, in the development of commercialized infrastructure as a concept to begin with, as a paradigm to begin with, at the frontier of public-private partnerships, even when it was just about beginning to be talked about in this country. ILFS, the organization with which he has grown and the organization which has grown around him, has arguably been driving the engine of commercialized infrastructure development, even as it was laying the railway track ahead of it. I can list any number of extremely innovative interventions that ILFS, under the leadership of Hari Shankaran and others at ILFS, have been the father or the mother of. Whether it is the accelerated depreciation that somebody talked about in the morning, or it is figuring out how to reward equity during even the initial years of construction, given the long gestation period of infrastructure projects and how difficult it is to generate any returns, to amending the Indian Tolls Act in state after state, for creating the structures, the model concession agreements, even thinking about what does it mean to allocate risks between the public and the private sector, bringing in commercial funding from the private sector, from private equity, from the World Bank, from the Asian Development Bank, roping in HUDCO. Mr. Rana, who's here, former chairman of HUDCO with us. He will remember the many aggressive moves that ILFS must have made on his office to rope him into many of the infrastructure initiatives. So I remember the conversation that I've had with him and Ravi Pathasarthi, the chairman, and others at the ILFS, when we used to be told, somebody's got to do it. We know we can make a hell of a lot more money, maybe even making washing machines, but somebody's got to do this work as well. So it's that with that pioneering spirit that his organization has pushed the infrastructure frontier. I'm delighted and honored that we're going to hear from him on, as the keynote speaker this evening. Mr. Ashok Lavasa holds the key, or holds the lock, depending on how you look at it, to some of the most fundamental problems surrounding infrastructure: environment clearance, forest land. All of us, if you list 3 problems of infrastructure development, you're going to hear issues about land, issues about environment, issues about financing. And we have with us here Hari Shankaran, who represents the commercial financing world, Mr. Ashok Lavasa, who is the Secretary to the Government of India and the Ministry of Environment and Forest, and Mr. K.P. Krishnan, who is the Additional Secretary of Land Resources. So we can ask them, why ain't it happening? Okay. Richard is going to bring a very interesting perspective from across the seas, from MIT, where he's been involved in figuring out how best to allocate risks. What kind of contracting strategies can be followed? What kind of contracts can be developed to allocate risks between parties, to allocate risks between today and tomorrow, to figure out how to create contingent risks so that we don't have to price all the risks today? How does regulation interplay with the idea of having contingent risks? All those interesting, complex issues are issues that he's going to address. So between the 4 of them, as I promised, you'll probably get all your answers. Over to Hari.
Thanks, Pradeep. Friends, when Pradeep called up and said that he'd like me to speak at this forum, he promised me 1 hour. When I came up the lift, the person who brought me up the lift said it's, I think, around 40 minutes. When I met Pradeep, he said it's 20 minutes. We're starting 20 minutes late. So I think I've got about 2.5 minutes left if I have to get everybody to speak and have a fruitful discussion. Having said that, I'm going to take my 20 minutes and try and eyeball 3 issues that I think have become key to trying to understand what we can do to infrastructure. The government sees infrastructure, and the world I suspect, as something that's essential for development. And having worked in the sector for 25 years, I can't think of anything that's less true. And let me explain that. Which in very blunt terms establishes what it is the state can do and what it is the citizens can expect. That gap came into sharp relief in the 1990s when we went through a fiscal crisis. Our solution as a state was to figure out how we can bring private sector money into the sector and private sector efficiency into the sector, and the rest is for the world to see. India has now become the largest PPP market in the world. So if you look at it simply as fixing a problem that the government has, i.e., I don't have enough money to build infrastructure, I've got these arrangements in place by which I can raise this money and I can get this infrastructure done for a price, it begs the question of what was the role of state in the first place that was contracted, so to speak, with the people of this country, and what was the expectation of the people of this country vis-a-vis the government of the day. This debate takes peculiar forms. So in government, for example, the talk of infrastructure, a model is very good in government if they can dump 100% of the cost of the risk of infrastructure on private sector. Private sector is desperate for business. It always is. Private sector, therefore, makes its own estimates on what that risk will be, whether they can fix it, not fix it, whether they can manage it, not manage it, and they take a punt. You see absurd situations like the telecom license fee that we got into the mid-90s. You get into absurd situations where you have toll premiums paid back to government on the VGF scheme without recognizing a simple fact that this risk that's being pushed from the private sector to the public sector, back to the private sector, to the banks, is actually a cost which is eroding the value of that service to the people of this country, to our society. And that lack of understanding, both in the private sector and in the public sector, in my view, is a fundamental problem in the way we design our projects, the way we design our institutions to deliver these services, and in the way we price our services to recover investments, if it's private sector or for the government service in terms of developmental aspects. So the big debate that we need to get engaged in is, what is the construct of the paradigm between state and citizen which will permit us to actually build the kind of services that we need to make this country evolve to the next level of development. I don't know if my facts are still valid or not, but about 7 years ago, there were 3 districts in Orissa which were considered to be, in Human Development Index terms, perhaps the worst in the world. And the government of India, if I'm not mistaken, allocated something like 5,000 crores for its development. Up to 6 years ago, and it was sanctioned sometime in about 1997, 1998. Up to 6 years ago, this deprived region of these 3 districts received from that allocation approximately 0 out of 0. 5,000 crores, if I'm not mistaken, was a number that was allocated but could not be spent. You have to ask the question, how can a ministry be given the money to spend and not spend it? You have another interesting construct. There's a bid out by NHI. It's right now out. And Mickey, I'm sure you probably know about this. The same stretch of road has been bid out, one as EPC and the other as a BOT. The EPC cost by the ministry or the NHI for that project is 2,000 crores odd. For BOT is 1,000 crores odd. What are we talking about? In the same NHI, 2 members, I suppose, handling one EPC, one BOT. One has a project cost estimate of 2,000 crores for EPC, and in the same bid for under BOT is 1,000 crores. Again, in my mind, it's an example of how we are not understanding what the real challenge is. The real challenge is, how do we want to design our projects to achieve the kind of outcomes that the public seek? And this challenge takes on even more bizarre forms. If you look at the sector, the power sector, for example, I was amazed at the fact that for something like now 6 years or 7 years, we've had 23,000 megawatts of gas-based power projects working at an average PLF of sub 20. The argument, we can't get D6 gas, I understand that, and LNG imported is too expensive. You compute the cost of not producing 23,000 megawatts of power for 6 years and tell me which is more expensive. You compute the cost of the LNG you need to import to get these 23,000 megawatts working 100% PLF and amortize this cost across the people of the regions in which these PPAs are being supplied. I can guarantee you at $14 MMTU, the cost of imported LNG to keep these 20,000 megawatts operational and fully supplying to the grid is under 15 paisa per unit. Under. We have the maths, but who's listening? So you go to the private sector and the guy says, my PPA says I'm going to get 1 rupee 75 paisa for my unit. I can't afford to buy gas. You go to the ministry says, how the heck do I get this done? You go to the disco and he says, how do I pass this on? There is a lack of understanding, and lack of understanding is in the institutional processes and arrangements because of our different motivations. Bottom line is 23,000 megawatts has not been produced for the last 6 years. Several good private sector balance sheets have been destroyed. Many more, I think if I'm not mistaken, the number at risk in terms of banking circles is something close to 250,000 crores of loans are at risk of NPA for these 23,000 megawatts. How do we put all of this together to come up with a strategy that allows us to discuss it in a way which allows us to get solutions that work? As a keynote speaker, I have the right to say how I want to frame my keynote. So I'm going to pose these questions, and I'm going to request Ashok Lavasa and KP Krishnan to address it as they go forward. But I want to give one suggestion as far as this problem is concerned. And this problem is very simple, that we need to move away from public or private and focus on partnership. We had in the 60s, you remember, a planned holiday from planning. I'm suggesting for a moment we have a planned holiday from ownership. That we actually worry about what it is that we need to get done, both public and private, for designing projects that are sensible, rational, implementable, and are accountable for the outcomes that they deliver. We began a project about 5 years ago. It's in Gazipur. We pick up the waste and then we recycle it. It's actually in Okhla, Gazipur, and one other place which I forget, but around the Delhi area. When the Asian Games took place in the city, 90,000 tons of construction debris had to be evacuated from the city in 60 days. And the government turned to us and said, do you want to have a shot at this? So we said, sure. So we did it in about 48 days. But having mounted now 90,000 tons of construction debris in some site that was given to us, the second question arose, what do we do with it? So I forget when the Asian Games was 4 years ago, right?
You mean the Commonwealth?
Commonwealth Games.
2010.
So we're now in 2014, right? So 4 years ago. So we had 90,000 tons of construction debris at a site which we were supposed to manage. We successfully, in 48 days, cleaned up the city from construction debris. It's on record. And the challenge now arose, what do we do with this waste? So we spent the next 4 years developing products out of this waste. In the last 14 months, we've figured out a way by which we can recycle 94% of the waste. Construction debris. We've spent the last 36 months around trying to get certification to include this product into pavement blocks, building materials, and so on and so forth. One of the big, amazing discoveries is something close to 40% of this waste is actually sand. You don't need to dig Yamuna for that 40% that you recovered. It's inferior to river sand by a margin of 30%. And there are certain constraints on where you can use it and where you can't use it. But the bottom line is, it's extremely valuable. We can recycle. To be able to take it to scale, which means that every city across this country will have a waste recycling plant in a manner which allows us to commercially exploit the produce of the recycling. The municipality doesn't pay us anything. We sell product to recover our investment. I would argue that today it is amongst the most profitable infrastructure activities in IL&FS Group across all sectors. Recycling waste. We have many recycling companies. I'm not sure what they recycle. I know they don't recycle waste. Now, the question that we have to ask ourselves is, if we cannot design projects in a way which meets an outcome, and then when you have a successful experiment, if you cannot take it to scale, there's something lacking in the way we're looking at the sector and the way we want to make it work. The third aspect is in the financing. Almost all infrastructure financing has gone to banks. Almost all banks are stressed out and have reached their ceilings. We have known this for at least 6 years. Representation we made as to what we can do in order to be able to put that in place. But nothing has happened. And today we have a problem in which we do not have the financial resources to generate the debt that we need to fund the kind of loans that are required to put infrastructure back on the map to the quantity and scale that we want. But we have a bigger problem, and that's equity. There is no private company in this country that has the equity in the amount required, as patient as it has to be, to invest in infrastructure. We haven't addressed that problem either. So we can build the best design projects, we can take to scale successful prototypes, but we do not have the money, either by way of debt or by way of equity, to support that massive expansion. But there's a solution that lies in front of us, and we're not seeing it. PSU banks have been the substantive provider of loan funds for the system. But you also have IIFCL, you have PFC, you have a whole bunch of other institutions that are in the space of infrastructure, but they are bound by constraints that do not permit them to leverage. So I will put across on the table, because KP is here and he knows the subject better than I do, is what if we created a common balance sheet of all these PSU finance companies? Overnight, you have a balance sheet that is equal to, and greater than, the balance sheet of the loan books of banks in the Indian financial system as on date. If you were to permit them to dilute government stakes in these entities to sub 51%, and I'm proposing 49% because infrastructure requires government, and that's an investment that needs to be kept there, and you put 51% into the market, you will have an incredible opportunity to create value and long-term patient capital for this country. You could actually implement the solution in under 6 months. If you do that, you get 3 benefits. The first benefit is you've released pressure of the commercial banking system. The second benefit, you create a vast amount of patient capital for the sector. The third benefit, because you bring in competition, because you bring in the way in which it's going to be managed, you actually change the way things can be designed for implementation. We did a back of the envelope calculation, but an order of magnitude, if you do this, you're able to raise something close to $100 billion of patient equity and $300 billion over time of the amount of debt funding you require to finance the infrastructure sector. In total, it is at least 2 times what the commercial banking loan portfolio is for infrastructure. It will also send a signal to the world. India is open for business because it can implement what it's dreaming of. I've almost taken all my time, so I'm going to take just 2 more minutes to wrap up the address. I believe we need to have a discussion on how we design projects. We need to have a way of actually scaling up successful prototypes. The example that I would like to place before all of you is what happened in Heathrow. The consortium that successfully expanded on Heathrow's Terminal 5 had created capability. And the government of the UK, which follows a similar process of transparency in this country, called these guys and said, we'll give you Stanton Airport, provided you cut off 3% or 5% of the cost at which you did Heathrow Terminal 5 on an adjusted basis. These guys now knew that 3 years from now, the same people who are working on this project could be shifted out to that project. And if memory serves me right, this is about a 10-year-old story, if memory serves me right, this, on the combined basis, the UK government made a savings of close to 15%. It was transparent, it was a bid-out price, it was effective, and you gave the contractor the time to invest in capacity to replicate and get the efficiencies to benefit the state. There are different contracting arrangements that you need to look at if you want to take successful prototypes in this country to scale. In the same context, keep in mind, there's only one balance sheet in this country that can do construction on a large scale, L&T. I know Mickey's sitting here, but the only balance sheet that has, because he's not a pure construction company. Punj Lloyd is a pure construction company. No pure construction company can match the balance sheet of L&T. You need balance sheet to do infrastructure. Thank you very much.
If I was to try to summarize the message of Hari, basically he's drawn our attention, whether it's on the issue of design and structuring of an infrastructure project, whether it's on the issue of allocating risks of infrastructure projects which are being done in a commercialized format using the public-private partnership mode, whether it's the design of financing strategies and financing instruments to attract capital domestically and from international sources to infrastructure. He's drawing our attention to the disconnect that appears to exist between the public policy and private sector needs. And therefore, the weakness in the last P, the partnership in the PPP. And that's where the focus therefore needs to be if you're going to bridge the gap. I turn to you, KP. You're a thoughtful guy. You've worked in the infrastructure sector for many years. You were in the leadership of urban infrastructure development in government of Karnataka. You were in the Ministry of Finance, handling capital markets, if I remember correctly. Your PhD in financing of urban infrastructure, and now you're in land resources. So you've kind of touched various aspects, whether it's the capital story or the land story that surrounds infrastructure. Let me ask you one question to start off, and then you can take it whichever way you like. Would you agree that aggregating land for economic development in general and for infrastructure development in particular is a legitimate duty of the sovereign and is best performed by the sovereign? Would you agree, disagree? Would you give us your thoughts on what the response of government is likely to be in the future to this?
I'm not sure what is the likely response of the government, but let me first take a shot at it purely conceptually. Why should aggregation be the responsibility of the state unless we can show a market failure? As a rule, why do you want to propose a role for the state given the ability of the Indian state, capacity, past history, weak governance, etc.? So the question I would like to actually pose is, do we know what is the market failure here? And the market failure, I think, is you actually don't have a market for land. So rather than waste a lot of time, as we've been doing, on worrying about the problem of land acquisition, the role of the state, I think we need to worry about what are the various steps that we need to take to create this market for land. And I suspect there are very few states which have actually gone down this route. And my answer would be to focus a lot more on that question. What are the 5, 6, 10 things that one would need to focus on to create a market for land so that we don't actually have to answer this question at all in the first place?
You want to respond to that, Hari?
If that means that I, as a private sector, have to go and acquire land, I can see many difficulties, starting with the legal framework under which land acquisition is in fact implemented. So the question back to you is, how do you create a market for land?
Yeah.
And how do you deal with the basic challenge that what you need is large areas of land which are contiguous, or long stretches of land depending on the project?
That is
a
answered,
road project?
Because once you create a market for land, what he's saying is you can
Right,
do what
but
you want.
how do you answer the problem of there being spoilers, right? Being difficult to aggregate land, and that's the emphasis. It's not just buying land. Obviously, if you want to buy land for setting up a small factory, you want to buy land for private house construction, no one expects the government to have to step in. But I'm talking about projects of a nature which requires prima facie, and obviously I'm saying this in the context of the controversy and debate around land acquisition bill, as I'm sure you realize, both in terms of cost that is associated with the process and in terms of the process and delays therein.
Yeah, let me answer the question that Hari posed. What is the biggest problem in creating the market for land? If you actually go into this question of why is there so much interest in getting land acquired by the state for projects, the answer is actually not cost. The answer is title. The truth is, unless I get the land to the state to intervene, extinguish all previous inchoate or complete title to a particular piece of land, and create clean title in favor of the state, and then transfer it, let's say, to X for an infrastructure project, the title continues to be suspect unless I do this, because the only other way in which you can get title confirmed in India is to actually go through a process called a title declaratory suit, which at a minimum takes 6 to 8 years and is known to take 20 years. And that is not a conclusive process because A, it is judicial. You can go right up to the Supreme Court. So what we need to establish is what a lot of OECD and a lot of other developing countries have now done, which is establish a conclusive title framework, which requires an entire legislative framework. We need a new law, we need amendments of existing laws, and parallelly, like for instance has happened in the US and has happened in Australia, there is a huge market for title indemnity. The moment I put in place a title guarantee system, there is a market waiting which is to give assurance to you, indemnifying you against all possible consequences of defective title.
Correct.
And what does this require is a longish answer. If there is time, I'll be happy to come back to it. But the answer to your question of what do you do when there are spoilers, when there are holdouts, eminent domain has always been used across the world to handle spoilers and holdouts. But you don't acquire the entire project land using an involuntary forced process. A bulk of the land is actually bought by the developer, by the project conceptualizer in the land market, and the role of the state that I see is in providing this public good, namely creating a legal framework, the title guarantee framework, an enabling framework for the development of an indemnity market, so as to enable Hari and you to go and buy the lands that you want.
I have two problems with this construct. Let me just preface it by something else. As we speak, we run a concession for land registration in the Philippines. The entire Philippines land records have been digitized by ILFS, have been put on what are called land centers across 167 centers across the country, and an office of ours in Gurgaon. So if you want to buy and get confirmation in the Philippines, it comes to satellite, comes to an office in Gurgaon, goes back and confirms it for you in the Philippines. It's been done very successfully. We can show the model to you. When I came back here, I was very excited. I said, why can't we do this for the same reason? And I was told by a very senior bureaucrat that, we may not want it to be in place.
No, it's there in Gujarat. You don't have to go to Philippines.
That's right.
This is what you described right now.
Is already operational.
Including the marriage of textual data and cadastral survey maps, physical details of the land, permitted land use, and satellite imagery in terms of contours, watersheds. All of this for the click of a button for Gujarat is already available. Haryana is close to this. Haryana has done this in 2 pilot districts. Very many Indian states have done it, but they haven't done the complete thing. Gujarat has been at it for the last 12 years. So Gujarat is now, I think, certainly where Philippines is. I don't know exactly where Philippines is. Gujarat is perhaps beyond that.
South of Singapore somewhere.
I understand your appreciation of the intelligence of the bureaucrat. I fully acknowledge that most of us will live up to this, but notwithstanding.
The second question
let
for
me,
you
let me,
is
let me
a
return
BOT.
to this.
Second is the BOT. At the end of 30 years, I've invested in a project. At the end of 30 years, I hand over this project back to the state free of cost. If I own the underlying asset, which is the land on which I've built this asset, I will not return it back free of cost. Then government at the end of the 30 years will have to pay me a value for the asset. So it's a big shift from the model of BOTs have been followed in the country today, if you go down your road.
Yeah, let me return to you, KP, a little bit later, and perhaps the audience will have a couple of questions as well on this issue of land. But suffice it to say that, regardless of all the different elegant constructs that we can talk about, the reality is that today the economy in general and the developer community in particular is groaning under the problems created by their inability, for whatever reasons. And I don't think the reasons lie in their lack of effort or lack of ability to spend or the willingness to spend. But they are groaning under the difficulties associated with acquiring land. And I would argue that so many of the infrastructure, road projects particularly, which are today stressing the banking community, as Hari also pointed out, if you trace the roots of the stress, very often you will find that it was the difficulty in acquiring land which led to the slowdown and hence all of that. But let me turn to another equally, if not more, sensitive and painful issue, which is obviously of the environment clearances and forest land diversion clearances. Like I said, if you list three problems, this would, score very highly in that ranking. And Ashok Lavasa, who's the Secretary to Government of India in the Ministry of Environment, and by the way, has rich experience across the infrastructure sector. He's been Additional Secretary Power, he's been involved in power generation projects and renewable energy policy in the Government of Haryana as the Principal Secretary. He was, before he became Secretary in this ministry, Secretary in the Ministry of Civil Aviation. So he's seen, he's been on both sides of the environment debate as well, if I may say so. I would ask you, sir, would you agree that the process-related difficulties in particular, and I'm not talking about the substance, the process-related difficulties associated with obtaining environment clearances in general and obtaining clearances related to forest land in particular have caused very substantial, if not immense, frustration and delays in the ability of the private sector to be able to implement infrastructure projects at the pace and speed and cost as the country needs?
Well, thanks, Pradeep. I think precisely for the reason that I worked in power and infrastructure sectors and civil aviation, government decided to send me to environment. Probably as a, I don't know whether it was retribution for me or remorse or poetic justice. But I was waiting for Hari to mention environment-related issues.
He was being kind.
In his generally melancholy keynote. I hope it was not a sign of despair that he didn't talk about environment. But I have spent about 3 months in this ministry, and I have still not come to the conclusion that it is more sinned against than sinning. Although what I feel is that there is nobody who would not like fresh air. There is nobody who would not like clean water. And yet, and there is nobody who wants a harmful environment. But nobody likes the Ministry of Environment. So I think there is a lesson in that. And I am trying to learn that lesson. And what I feel is that there are number of reasons why this kind of feeling has been generated. Some of them are based on experience, and some of them, I think, are structural issues. I will not go into what the ministry does. And I think that is not the real issue. Probably the issue is how it is done. And I think those are some of the issues which have irked several project proponents who have interacted with this institutional mechanism of giving clearances. In the last few months, there has been an attempt to precisely address some of these issues. First of all, I do believe, and I'm sure that many people will understand, that dealing with environment issues in itself it's a difficult task. It's not all that easy. Because the impact assessment which has been mandated and the several layers of screening which is done, I think it has led to some delays, and there is a case for simplification, there is a case for introducing more transparency, there is a case for making the entire system more predictable. In fact, rather than go into what happened in the past, I would like to focus on what the ministry is doing now. Incidentally, there are not too many projects which have been rejected by the Ministry of Environment. The question is that if you take 36 months to clear a project, is it possible for you to do it in maybe 6 months? So I think that is a question. What we are now doing is whenever anybody needs an environment clearance, and I'm talking about the environment clearances which are given to Schedule A projects which are in the domain of the Ministry of Environment, there are a whole lot of projects which are in the domain of the state authorities. First of all, you get what are known as terms of reference approved. Now, what we are currently engaged in is that, is it possible, or why is it not possible, for the terms of reference for various industries, depending on various types of locations, to be standardized? Now, if you standardize the terms of reference, then you straight away cut one step or one major stage of giving approvals by the ministry. So the terms of reference are known for industry types, and it is then possible for a project proponent to register himself with the ministry and do his environment impact assessment without waiting for individual projects' terms of reference to be cleared. At the same time, the expert appraisal committee, which looks at all the projects for giving terms of reference approval, will look at that project in the first sitting of the expert appraisal committee after the project has been registered and suggest to the project proponent that, okay, the standard terms of reference are fine, but these are the two other things that we would like you to look at. Now, and I'm confident that in the next few months, we should be able to standardize the terms of reference. The second thing which has happened in the last 2-3 months is that all applications for forest clearance and environment clearance are now online. And you can actually track the fate of your application, but that is not sufficient unless the decision-making processes themselves are simplified. As far as the forest clearances are concerned, and let me just touch upon one more thing. We are also working on a system where a project proponent applies one time to the ministry if he needs more than one clearance. And when you make the system online, I think it doesn't matter too much because it is possible through technology to transfer the data of one application to another. So I don't think it is so much of an arduous task. But one portal of the ministry on which all applications, whether they are coastal zone regulation clearances, forest clearances, or environment clearances, all these applications could be given one time. Now, on the forest clearance side, I think there are issues both pertaining to the procedure and those that pertain to law. But what I find, in fact, I just reviewed 3 days back, and you will be surprised that there are not more than 30 cases which are pending in the ministry for giving forest clearances. I think there are two reasons which have led to this kind of negative impression about the forest clearances. One is the entire issue of approvals pertaining to the coal blocks. And there I feel that perhaps the way to do, and this is what I have told the coal secretary this time, that please don't put any coal block on auction if it is not cleared by the Ministry of Environment upfront. And when I say cleared, I don't say that it has the forest clearance straight away, but the Ministry of Environment and Forests must say that I don't have an issue with this block, and as and when the project proponent or the allocatee completes the formalities, I will in due course give him the clearance. But per se, I don't have a problem. And the problem arose, I think, because so many coal blocks were allocated, and that is where I would disagree with Pradeep. It is not the private sector alone. It is the public sector also which got the same treatment. I mean, I was in Haryana, we had a coal block, and to this day, after 8 years, we don't have a forest clearance. So it is not as if the private sector or the public sector was given a different treatment. But the problem is that when you allot coal blocks or when you auction coal blocks, they were not auctioned, they were all allocated, without taking clearance, whether this block has any difficulty, then you are creating a vested interest and you are creating expectations which other part of the system is unable to fulfill. There was a time when the entire forest area was divided into go and no go. That classification has been done away with, but nobody can argue that if there is very rich biodiversity, there are very rich forests under which a lot of minerals sit, then I think as a nation, it is our duty to take a call. Whether we want to preserve that forest for some more time, let the mineral lie there for a few more years and not extract it. It is a call which the policymakers have to take. And it is a call which should be taken before you ask people to invest in those blocks. So that it is clear. As a nation, we say that, okay, here is 8 or 10% of our area. We are not going to touch it for the next few years. It can always be reviewed. And now, taking on from what Krishnan said, we have all the forest maps, cadastral maps, 1 meter by 1 meter resolution available. They're available with the ministry and they're also available for people to access. We have been working very closely with ISRO to induct as much as technology as possible in our decision-making process. And I'll stop with one more thing, and I think that is presenting itself as a huge challenge for the administrators of environment, and I think for society at large. And because environment concerns are relatively new, although we say that India, we believe in nature worship, and in our mythology we worship gods who represent various incarnations of nature, etc. But the point today is that when you convert all this into regulations and laws, then you need the capability, and you need the will, and you need the participation of everybody to enforce these regulations. And I'm currently wondering that if you are going to have more and more laws about hazardous waste and e-waste and all kinds of ozone depleting substances, and I am sure that this is not the end. There are many more new things which can come. So how are we going to have a system in which all these laws, regulations will be enforced? I think this is something which everybody in the country should think about. Is it only possible to enforce this through a battalion of inspectors? Or are we looking at a more responsible society which becomes sensitive and is conscious that yes, I need to enforce this law, this regulation on myself? Having said all this, I do believe that there is a case for making the laws predictable, making the regulations predictable, making the procedures simple and transparent.
Thank you very much. And I couldn't agree more with you. We do need to become forward-looking and not necessarily lament the past and keep remembering our wounds and injuries. And in doing that, if I may sort of make also a plug for the Indian School of Business, we would be delighted to have the opportunity of partnering with the government in being able to facilitate a discussion with industry, facilitate a discussion with the owners of science and technology, which I think is the crying need as well. I know you referred to some of that yourself. I think some of the procedures can benefit enormously and can be very much simplified if we introduce technological tools that are currently available. And I'm also in the process trying to draw your attention to the need for consultation. And it's heartening to note that the government is engaged in trying to simplify procedures and is engaged in trying to figure out ways of making all this quicker. But in the process, engagement in discussion and consultation with the developer community, with the financing community, with academia, which can also bring their analytical tools and research to bear upon some of these problems, would be immensely useful and would actually help the government in taking this forward. Because sometimes you really do feel when you're outside, sometimes you do wonder whether the government really knows the extent of the problem. And I think it'll be useful for you to put the ear to the ground. I mean, talked about forest clearance without putting too much detail into this. Today the situation is that to divert a 5-acre plot of land in a 700-acre power project from Chote Bade Jhad Ka Jungle to project purposes, we require the file to move through 18 levels from the range officer to the Minister of Environment. It's so centralized, including the Supreme Court appointed committees. 18 levels once, then the file goes down, then it comes up again after payment has been made for afforestation and then goes down again. So that's 72 levels of approvals for diverting 5 acres of land. 5 Gram Sabhas have to be held of the same village, the same Gram Sabha, because the Environment Protection Act, Environment Conservation Act requires a Gram Sabha, the Forest Rights Act requires a Gram Sabha, the Forest Act requires a Gram Sabha, the Environment Clearance Act requires a Gram Sabha, and every time, the Deputy Commissioner or the state government or the central government cannot say that once the Gram Sabha has approved this, it's approved for all purposes. You can't even call a Gram Sabha under all the acts at the same time. It has to be called 5 times over. And you know better than anybody else what it means to be able to get things through Gram Sabha. So those kind of issues can be greatly simplified. If I may, and I know that you need to be leaving soon, so we will take 1 or 2 questions from the audience before you leave. I hope that's okay. But I'm going to turn to Richard, and who's going to talk to us about the whole question of risk allocation and structuring, something that Hari also referred to in his keynote address.
Thank you very much, Pradeep. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, to learn from you, and to appreciate the enormous interest there is in the development of infrastructure here. What I'd like to do is to talk a little bit, first of all, about a change in perspective. As the word has come up many times about getting the project done, for example, a project. But I want to suggest to you that we need to think about various bits of infrastructure as not individual projects, but as part of an ongoing system. So, for example, if we're building a road from here to Jaipur, for example, or to Mumbai, it is not just a link now. It is part of a transportation link that will evolve over time, that will be larger, that will change in function, they'll have different kinds of vehicles over time. And we want to think about it in its entire life cycle. And then we want to face the other fact is that this life cycle is, of course, long, 10, 15 years at least for a concession, but even longer in its real life. And that what's also important about that is we really don't know what the project is going to have to, the system is going to have to bear in 10, 15, or 20 years. One phrase encapsulates this is the forecast is always wrong. That is simply extrapolating what's been happening in the past or thinking about what the nation might be like is not going to capture all the different kinds of changes that may occur, whether there are changes in the value of the rupee or whether there are changes in the development of fuels or power or the sources of power. There are so many surprises that happen. So that the piece of infrastructure that we're trying to put into place as part of a larger system is going to have a variety of different needs on it, and it is subject to a considerable risk in terms of how well it's going to perform. And I've gone to learn a lot about this in India in particular, in addition to my worldwide experience, in particular thanks to my former student Arjun Gupta, who is here, who has studied this for me and helped me understand the successes and the various failures, if you want, not necessarily due to the proponents, but due to the changes in the system. So I think we need to focus on risk management as a key concept, but I prefer to talk about it as uncertainty management, because there is an enormous amount of uncertainty about what will happen, and it's not all bad. The future may not turn out as we expected, but it may turn out not that way in a good sense. There may be more traffic, more demand. It may be better than we had anticipated, in addition to worse. So it seems to me that in that context, we need ways to deal with these uncertainties. We need contingency plans, if you want. Another way to think about it is contingency plan sounds pretty sophisticated, but we can simply think about it as flexibility to evolve the system to do the right thing at the right time. That might mean to expand it or not to expand it. It might mean to change its capabilities by using different kinds of transportation on a highway or a railway. And that can be thought of not only in terms of the physical design, which I think is important, but as we can think about if we're trying to manage the risk over time or the uncertainty over time for a particular system, we might want to start by building relatively smaller at the beginning, but with the capability to expand. So I came in from Chandigarh to Delhi not too long ago by road, and what was amazing to me as I did it was this road was still under construction near as I could see it. It was jammed packed from the moment I left Chandigarh, and they were building the overpasses with no capability to expand it because they had built them just for the existing lanes. And it was pretty obvious that at some point it should be changed. So that one needs to think about how one evolve the system right from the start. We should extend that also to, I think, to the contracting devices. Since we don't know how the world will turn out, and we don't know how the project will turn out within the context of the larger system, it seems we need to build, I would suggest, we need to build in to our contracts in the PPPs ways to either scale back the project or to relieve the pressure on the private contractors if that is what's absolutely necessary. But on the other hand, we should have clawback or other situations if the project is doing better than way better, that in a politically unacceptably way that the private interest is making too much, we have a way of returning that to the public. In other words, we need to think about building in a thoughtful flexibility in the project contracts so that it can be a true partnership as we renegotiate, but on a pre-agreed terms, but reset the terms of engagement as we go forward. so that we're not left in the position where the state may want to enlarge the highway, but the concessionaire says, well, I already have it, I'm the only one you can deal with, and I can't do anything else. So this is part of what I would like to suggest to you, is that we need to recognize the long-term uncertainty. It can be downside risk, but it can be upside opportunity, and that we need to build into our thinking a way of developing this, not just physically, but also in a contractual way, so we can adjust to deliver what's appropriate as the future unfolds in 5, 10, 15, 20, and 25 years.
Thank you, Richard. So how to address the whole issue of risk in the future? Mr. Lavasa has to leave to be in a meeting with the minister, but before he does, he will be able to take one question, and Atul has his hand up already. Did you? Yeah.
Well, I think just to add on to what was said earlier, Hari, I think you forgot to mention the fact that dispute resolution is a major, major impediment in India, where you have ONGC, for example, carrying 30,000 crores of contingent liabilities, NHAI settling 25,000 crores worth of claims for a paltry number, simply because the banks have got guns to all our heads. So you just want some cash to get that sorted out. I think one of the challenges I'd like to throw to the team on the dais, really, it's been known in India that the Indian Administrative Service arguably is one of the most intellectually elite clubs in India. We've all recognized that growing up over the years. A lot of the issues that we face are issues that have been created by the same elite intellectual club. The laws, what they cover, what they don't cover, the extent of regulation, the extent of procedure. Is there a sense that this group of intellects can actually get together and take the current set of problems as a challenge and find a way to resolve them in a manner that is known to everybody? Because what I find is in many conferences, we rehash and rehash and rehash the same dialogue. We all know what the answers are, but we're not seeing any concrete result of it coming thus far. We do have a Prime Minister now who's leading from the front, but I think this actually is a challenge to the same people that have, the same group of people that have created a lot of these procedures, like you yourself being an ex-IAS person, says 72 times to convert 5 acres of land. Okay. Now, obviously the intellect is there, we know what needs to be done. If we talk about ease of doing business rankings, we just need to look at the top 10 companies. What makes them easy? What makes doing business in those countries easy? And mirror on top of that, what is it that India is doing that's different? You'll obviously have a set of solutions. So I think the answers are known, but we tend to just keep on.
So is there a what in the elite intellectual club should be?
Is there a desire, a commitment to accept the challenge that's saying, okay, we know what needs to be done, we're going to get together, we have the opportunity now with this leadership, let's fix it.
The perfect question for you to address as you depart.
I don't agree with the adjectives that you used. Yeah.
You don't agree the I or the E or the C?
But what I certainly agree with is that there is a need to resolve many of these issues. And let me tell you that I don't think these issues can be resolved without consulting the people who are involved in going through these processes. And that is, I think, to my mind, the only way in which some of these issues could be addressed. Many of these issues are also legislative in nature, and they will require some kind of, going through a maze of laws and cleaning up some of these, taking regulatory bodies and quasi-judicial authorities and including, in some cases, the courts on board. Because what has happened truly is that there are so many court orders which impinge on the decisions that are taken, and I'm only speaking about the Ministry of Environment, that you think you've solved one issue and then suddenly somebody says that no, 1997 Madras High Court has an order on this. So you really need to wade through all this. We are trying our best, but just to make one more point, that currently and I'm using this opportunity to tell everyone that the municipal waste rules, the C&D rules, and I think e-waste, we are in the process of reviewing these rules, and they are up for public consultation. So we would be happy to take on board whatever suggestions come in making reasonable regulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ashok. Yes, before you leave, a memento from us. Thank you. Thank you.
And sorry to leave.
That's possible.
Thanks. That's the price we pay for having secretaries to Government of India grace these events. They do need to leave. We've had 3 such departures today, right? I noticed that Ashok, before leaving, took shelter behind the tyranny of the judicial system as well. And I see an eminent lawyer who's been working on infrastructure for most of his life, sitting amongst us. Do you have any Rajiv, do you have anything to say to this? Please introduce yourself. And
my name is Rajiv Luthra. You know, what I thought was, there was a professor earlier who was talking from Purdue, and he was saying we make these strategies and we make these round and round, and Atul mentioned about regurgitating the same thing again and again and again. We just heard Secretary Ilwasa talk about the problems of judiciary, etc. They're all there, and I can address them too. But what about the executive orders that can be done through executive order? Why are they not being done? What is the issue with that? Let's look at the low-hanging fruit and fix it. Why are we hiding behind, some of the high-hanging fruit? That's my one question. On the judiciary side, we have gone through, there is a process, a due process, and the judicial system has to look at various things. But again, there is a small thought there. We have a clogged up judiciary. Why can't we fix that? I'll give you an example. Whereas if you look at the entire cases that are pending in the lower courts, in the High Court, Supreme Court, roughly 67% of them has the government on one side or the other. Why can't the government issue a simple executive order that, for example, we have a matter which is about 50 lakhs, 5 million rupees. It cannot be appealed if the first appeal is lost by the government. The public can appeal it, but if the government loses it, no further appeal. 2 crores, no further appeal. We have matters in the Supreme Court today which are for 5 million, half a million rupees. I mean, each hearing costs you about that much for that damn matter. Why can't we fix this? I mean, I'd put it the other way.
put it back to the executive. So
the elite, intellectual elite.
May I also announce that Dr. Rakesh Mohan, the executive director at IMF, whose address you heard to listen to earlier, he is currently online and live, and also willing and able to engage in the question and answer session. So please, if you have a question addressed to him. Dr. Mohan, can you hear us?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Thank you. Right, thank you. Well, I'm not going to hedge you. KP, you want to take a shot at this?
At what?
At the executive's inability or unwillingness to pluck the low-hanging fruit of
Yeah. I actually, if you permit me, I want to come back to a question that he had asked and Mr. Lavasa answered. Given what Hari thinks of our intellect, I don't think it should be elite or intellectual, but notwithstanding that, I seriously think state capacity is a big issue. I don't think you can dismiss the state capacity issue by saying, here is a bunch of 4,000 officers who are perhaps academically outstanding, etc. I think the larger question of state capacity is now a major binding constraint in a lot of activities that India is undertaking now. For one, because these are complex issues. The command and control state was a relatively easy state to operate. But a liberal open, democratic, and almost free flow of capital, so an open macro economy with an RTI governance framework is a very different paradigm altogether, and I don't think the state is entirely equipped to handle a lot of the issues that are serious issues today. So I don't entirely buy the point that you made that we have all the answers and we are not simply implementing them. I don't think we have all the answers, at least internally. The answers may be somewhere else. We need to find them. The short sort of answer to the question that, point that you made about executive orders, completely with you. There are a number of issues that are solvable by executive orders, but specific, if you take the example of the 500,000 rupee court order, second appeal, why do we go for a third appeal? The answer has to be a framework, and for 50 years we haven't put down a framework. So the individual bureaucrat being afraid of an accusation that he was hand in gloves with you by not going an appeal will suggest an appeal. So we need to take that very clear call that this 500,000 bucks is, in a systemic sense, an amount of money that India can absorb, and we should have a clear-cut policy with no discretionary exceptions. Because we all have policies which says ordinarily there shall be no appeal. However, if there is a question of law involved, it's not the 500,000 bucks that you're fighting the question of law. Every appeal is under that exception. And we don't write policies that are clear-cut because we don't resolve these conflicts. So we do have executive instructions. I think we can do better. But I think there is an even more serious problem, which is a lot of these issues, I think we've typically approached them with very short-term solutions. The example that Hari gave, we started on this big binge of infrastructure building in 2002. India knew that infrastructure building is going to last 30, 40 years. We don't have infrastructure, which could have been created in 5 years. So we were looking at financing of infrastructure as a 40, 50 year issue. What is the solution that we find? We find bank financing. We find ECB, external commercial borrowing, which is unhedged foreign borrowings for projects where the entire revenue stream is rupee revenue. So everything that happened in 2008 to 12 was written into the answers that we found in 2002. And we are still finding a second round solution for the same problems, doing more of this. And what worries me is, in 1983 when I joined the service and I started talking about the long term, Janta said, long term is far away, concentrate on the immediate. I have 6 years to retire and I'm still being told that. That worries me.
Can I just add to this? I think KP has been extremely candid, and I think it's a point of deep concern also from where we all sit, which is that the capacity in government to handle these issues has been steadily eroded over the years. And what you find today is a short end of a very tough task, which is to bring into existence in this country market-based systems of governance. And the level of exposure in government today is completely abysmal to that task.
No, I agree. Sir, I was not being facetious, a little less time, but I'll quickly tell you, the 3 C's is a problem. It's very clear, the CBI, the CVC, and the CAG, without a doubt. But here, if there's an executive order, I agree the question of law, but a lot of these matters have nothing to do with law. There are 9 other high courts in India which are current courts, which means the amount of filing every year, disposal is higher. So if you just got rid of the backlog, we'd be better than the United States of America in terms of disposals. And it can be done. And this is only an executive order required, nothing else.
I don't disagree at all.
Yes.
Can we turn to some good news? The idea is to celebrate with that drink when we go down, not to try drowning our sorrows. What is going right? Atul, there's plenty going right in your part of the world, right? What's going right? What are we looking at in infrastructure
I think what
development?
we're looking at is on the highway side, we're seeing a significant amount of movement in terms of bids, which are cash bids, EPC bids, and not BOT bids. Frankly, I feel that the whole BOT story was overplayed earlier. I don't think any other country has outsourced its entire infrastructure to the private sector without having a development financing mechanism in place that gives you long-term finance at predictable rates, right? All of us had to depend on commercial credit, which was not long-term, which is a floating rate of interest. So what started out a road project being bid at an 8% return, 8% interest with a predicted 15% traffic growth, the interest rate went up by 50% to 12% or 13% now in some cases. Traffic growth went down by half. It's a recipe for disaster. So I think also the fact that there was no understanding of development with most contractors who became developers to secure contracts. So a lot of us went into the space as developers. We were fortunate, we were very, very cautious. But most contractors tried to become developers to just guarantee themselves construction work. So I think there's a lot of learnings from the last few years that need to be looked at. We need to address them in an institutionalized manner, and especially the whole dispute resolution mechanism, which is so outdated, right? And every bank is hurting. I was with some of the chairmen of banks in Bombay on Saturday. Their common grouse was if NHAI is saying they have settled 20,000 crores worth of claims for 900 crores, that means some contractor is going to take the hit, which means it's coming back to us as banks. So our problem is only getting exaggerated, it's not getting improved. So I think on the one side, there's an understanding, so a lot of projects are moving to the EPC space till they find solutions to the other areas. I mean, I've recommended to the finance minister and the prime minister to look at a TARP type mechanism, which the US had implemented when they had issues. There's got to be solutions, but they have to be looked at as real issues, a real problem, and addressed.
This issue of long-term finance, and you put it in an interesting construct. You're saying trying to do the BOT route at the scale and size that we did without having put in place a robust system for long-term institutional financing was a mistake. Where are we on this, Hari? I remember the time when we used to say, you know, find me a good project, there's no shortage of money, okay? Liquidity is not an issue. Money is not an issue. Find me a good project. Let's do structuring. Let's do project development. And I heard you say during your keynote, that's no longer true. Our balance sheets, you had an interesting creative solution, but the bottom line is that our bank balance sheets are running out. Our PSUs are over their heads in the prudential limits. And our $1 trillion or $500 billion 5-year plans for infrastructure development, are we going to be able to find the money of the right quantity and the right quality and the right tenure?
I'm consistent. I will still sing the song, find me the project, and I'll find the money for you.
Yeah.
I think so. I think what I was trying to get to was that we need to redesign the way we look at projects altogether. And there are lots and lots of low-hanging fruits. And I'll take you a simple example. Every PSU in this country has got 6 to 10 times the land they need to run their operations. We don't have a framework to monetize this. Every municipality can rezone, densify its distribution of property taxes, and actually incentivize through this. Kalyan Dombivli municipality in 1997 did this. They increased the revenue base of the municipality in one single year by 60%. And that's a scalar shift, because after that, they continue to grow in terms of property taxes. So there are so many low-hanging fruits. Now, the private sector could do the Kalyan Dombivli for every municipality in this country. We could probably have a scalar shift in revenues of municipalities like never seen before. What do we need? We need some practical capability to implement. Where I agree with KP is, I think if you ask a bureaucrat to take a decision, executive or otherwise, within his purview, then as Rajiv said, we have to ensure that the bureaucrat doesn't get fixed after he makes a decision. Today the system opens it up completely. So why should he take a decision?
No, but what about the relatively more mundane or technical but important question of long-term financing?
So we got
the infrastructure debt funds were announced with much fanfare. Where are we there?
So we have, for example, ILFS has raised close to 3,000 crores. We've already disbursed 1,000 crores. We're going for the next closing of $1 billion. we raised $1 billion in the pooled municipal debt obligation facility. We have disbursed most of it. We are now going to raise $10 billion under that same facility for disbursements to municipalities. But the money is not the problem. The problem is that you need to be able to figure out that this project is worth doing and then get it done.
KP?
Money will come.
I don't think we fixed the long-term debt problem in India. Individual projects, you may be able to structure, find the money.
Or
but I
ILFS
think-
may be able to do it, but as a nation,
Yeah. I think the answer to this, similar to what Rajiv and he said, we know the answers, and we've known the answers for 15 years. We need a well-functioning, liquid, deep corporate bond market to begin with, and then you automatically get the long tenor market once you have the corporate bond market. For this, you need the bond currency derivatives nexus, and there is enough and more written about this, not by experts alone, by 100 government committees. So we know all the answers, but the solutions are still nowhere near implementation.
No, but there's a good reason for that. No? For example, you can't do foreclosure on mortgages in this country. It's
No,
matters
but
over.
we know the answer to that problem also.
Yeah.
Because this problem was known in 2004. We've been talking about fixing the bankruptcy code, for instance, as the bankruptcy issue as being an important constraint for the non-development of the corporate bond market. Point well taken. But we discovered this at least 15 years ago. There have been 6 or 7 expert committees. There are draft legislations on this.
KB, and the interesting thing is, the reason it's not happened is got nothing to do with the law. It's got to do with the fiscal framework under which we operate these schemes. This was discovered subsequently in a transaction done by, if I'm not mistaken, IDBI and Citibank. That it was the fiscal framework which screwed up things as far as this market is concerned.
Mandar, I see your neck craning. Do you want to join this? Anupam, I'll come back to you, Mandar.
Rajiv was
Okay.
You have the good news? We'll save it.
Do the last word.
Yeah.
We'll come back to you in a minute. Anupam.
Yeah. I actually have 3 quick questions. But
Anupam looks pretty old, but we are classmates, huh, by the way.
Yeah, we'll come to that part later. 3 quick questions, but I'll start. My first question was actually an older one, which was that to what extent is land acquisition really an issue for infrastructure projects as opposed to industrial projects? Because you always have the eminent domain instrument, etc. But I'd like to come to the question that KP just answered. I've been peddling corporate bond markets also at some time. The problem in India or elsewhere is that the 2 big risks for infrastructure projects are execution risk and policy risk. Those cannot be dealt with financial engineering. And so that's why you end up essentially going back to bank finance. The problem we have, so the third number, question 1, do you think we have addressed the policy risk and execution risk in terms of systems and processes? I don't believe we have a framework. But then we go back to bank finance. The problem here is that we have what I call lazy banking in this country. Look at all the power projects. I happen to have been involved in power projects. The first thing you did was, all over the world, this was the World Bank, fuel risk. If you look at how many of them have gone bad, it doesn't seem that basic due diligence was undertaken adequately. And so the question that I have is, to what extent is due diligence capabilities in our financial system, in the banking system, satisfactory? 2, how do we deal with project and execution risks, which are real sector issues? Third is, to what extent is land acquisition really an issue for infrastructure projects? And I distinguish between land acquisition in terms of land markets versus the problems you have with squatters on railway right-of-way, that sort of thing. I don't call that a land acquisition issue.
All 3 your domain.
No, I'm not the IS here.
No, but it's not. He's asking about the state of play. So
All right.
you tell us the state of play.
So on the issue of land acquisition of infrastructure, it's been a nightmare where government has promised to give land to the proponent. It's an absolute nightmare. And in project after project, we are finding government commitment to be delinquent in terms of delivery to schedule. There's one specific example where I think a 400 kilometer road project in Punjab, where the NHA was to give land for the last, I think, 60 kilometers. And that led to non-delivery of 60 kilometers, meant that the company could not complete COD as defined in the concession. And the government took the view, narrow view, that it was a concessionaire event of default. Sorry, it was a concessionaire event of default, and that company is now bankrupt. They're fighting out in court, they're going to arbitration, but that company is bankrupt. So, where government is responsible for delivering land, they have failed to do so and have imposed huge burdens on the private concessionaires who have taken on the job on that assurance. Where private sector is allowed to acquire land by itself, they've been more successful. We ourselves have done a project in Rajasthan where we did 1,500 kilometers of 2-lane roads with hard shoulders. Mickey was part of the effort to make that happen, and they did the chunk of the work. We completed that 1,500 kilometer scheme in under 24 months. And including land acquisition, shifting of utilities, raising money, designing and approvals, took another 12 months. So in 36 months, from start to finish, Government of Rajasthan was able to complete, with private sector participation, a 1,052 kilometer road program for the state. That's KP's point, and therefore I agree with him. The question is the mechanics by which you get to a point where you can create a land market in this country, and that's going to be a tough set of actions to be taken, but hopefully we'll get there with KP in leadership there. On financing itself, appraisals, there's a method of appraisal, but an infrastructure is very different from an industrial appraisal. And as you mentioned, there are issues of, for example, we would not put money into a project that didn't have fuel supply if it's a power project. But for example, when Tata's bid on the UMPP, they had a fuel supply, they had a PPA, they had the land, and they had environmental clearance. At that point in time, nobody in the world was talking about the volatility of FX pass-throughs in the PPA. Nobody. Not in the bank, not in government, no one. The World Bank incidentally approved that UMPP saying it's a very good structure. Just to kill that point. But this is a fact. Just to kill that point, but this is a fact. So the world over, everybody said it is a great IFC, sorry. Not World Bank, but they're the private sector arm, no? So anyway, so they said it's great, all that kind of stuff. They took their fees also for this. When things then happened, and we realized there's a whole bunch of new risks on the table, the system that we have in banking or in government or in the private sector for that matter didn't have the mechanisms to respond. And we're stuck there. I think that's the point that you have been making. That is, how do we create a contracting framework that lets us respond to risks that we may not have anticipated arising and dealing with it?
Actually, we've become worse at it over the years. If you think about it, if you remember the telecom licensing, which Hari referred to in his address, were originally bid out on a fixed license fee, which were crazy. We had received crazy bids. And had we stuck to those, and had we said that the sanctity of the contract must be maintained, blah, blah, we would not have the robust telecom industry that we have today. We violated the contract, we violated the law, and we moved from a fixed license fee to a revenue sharing arrangement because we realized that there was a contingent risk that we had not factored in. And today we have the success story that we have. We have not been able to do that, for example, in the road sector. And the industry has been crying for it last 5 years. Nobody in the industry had anticipated the slowdown in the economic growth rate or the depreciation, devaluation of the currency, etc. But the NHAI and the government of India and the Ministry of Finance has not been able to rise to the occasion and take a pragmatic nationalist view. We heard about what the gas pricing issue. Now, technically, the grounds taken by the government on that issue are correct. But the fact of the matter is, if you look at it from a national interest point of view, somebody, maybe the Prime Minister, has to get up and say, trust me, I've thought this through. This belongs to the country and we're going to fix it. So those kind of, that's one way of dealing with contingent risk. Richard, of course, talked about more sophisticated contractual structures, which we will learn about and which we are learning about. Rajiv, we had some good news.
Yeah, I thought Kriti, who's my policy practice of my firm, was just telling me that, sir, how is it that the bureaucrats are always bashed at every conference? I said, actually, they're really brilliant people, and I mean it from the bottom of my socks. But I see that for
They
the last 10 days I've had, and just as a pure statistic, last 10 days I've had 6 meetings with secretaries of government of India in their offices. 4 of them were between 8:45 and 9 in the morning. With that, I hope you enjoy your drink, my friend.
Thank you very much. Can we bring the session to the close, or somebody has a burning question? Or Mandar, you have the last word. Mandar is a young member of the team at the Institute of Public Policy at the Indian School of Business in Mohali. So he's a law postgrad from Columbia University who we've been able to snap to work on issues of public policy. Yes, Mandar.
Yeah, my pleasure to be associated with Bharati Institute and ISB, sir. Just to respond to the last 2 points that were made, the NHA is recently experimenting with harmonious substitution of concessionaire, sort of permit exit for concessionaires that are otherwise in distress but not necessarily, defaulting on the concession agreement. Do you think that's a good way to address those policy risks that are, in some sense black swan-like, so that the new concessionaire can come in and start the process where the old concessionaire could not?
I don't know how harmonious they are actually, but Hari, you want to?
I think it's a very good move. The narrow issue becomes how quickly can the government implement it. It will certainly be a great exit for all the investors in road projects at this point in time.
Good. Thank you very much.